Wanted to welcome everybody to our breakout session for the day. I think we had a very lively debate this morning, so I think that warmed the audience up well. I think you're really going to enjoy this topic as well. We'll be talking about enterprise risk management in a post-Gulf spill world. And I'll be your moderator for the panel today. My name is Suzanne Schmeltz. I'm a partner in the advisory practice here in Houston. And I am joined by wonderful panelists. In fact, we had a great dinner last night. And if our discussion last night is any indication of the discussion we'll have today, I think you'll really enjoy their thoughts and different opinions about how ERM helps companies really add value to their business. So I'm joined by David Bowman with CMS Energy, James Graves with Murphy, and then Tim Jones with El Paso. And I'll let each of them go through a short introduction of their role, their company, to give you a little framework that sets the tone for the discussion then that we'll have about the different ways they approach ERM. But just some housekeeping at the beginning. I know that you guys probably know the drill from yesterday, but as you walked in, you probably saw cards on your chairs. And if you have any questions as we go through the discussion, please feel free and write them down. In fact, we could play a little game with this. We could, try to stump the panelists. This is the audience participation part. So we'll go ahead, write down questions. They'll bring them up to me, and we'll add some time at the very end just to make sure that we get through those questions as well. But we'll follow the same format that you've seen in the other panels. We'll just have question and answer, and I think it will be a very good discussion. So with that, why don't we start with just a brief introduction of each of our panelists and their companies. So I'll start with you, David.
Thank you, Suzanne. Well, I'm David Bachman. I'm the Executive Director for Risk Strategy and Financial Advisory Services at CMS Energy. It's kind of a long title, but my main job is the risk manager for the company. I own the risk policy and chair the risk committee for the company and manage the enterprise risk management program. Just in case you don't know too much about CMS, it's a Michigan-based energy company. Its principal subsidiary is Consumers Energy, which is an electric and gas utility, which owns generation and distribution on the electric side, and distribution and gas storage on the gas side. And our service territory is exclusively in Michigan. CMS, if you are familiar with the company, used to have a global portfolio of energy projects around the world, from IPPs to EMP businesses and pipelines. We sold all those businesses off about 5 years ago, which greatly changed our risk profile from a global, integrated, very diverse company with 9 or 10 subsidiaries to basically a company that went back to its core at the utility in Michigan. And at about that time is when we ramped up our energy risk management program, which has been operating 3 to 4 years. We've gone through about that many cycles of risk mapping and key risk indicator updates under our ERM program. It's grown in terms of participation, in terms of the dialogue we have with our management team. We do have regular updates with the board, so that oversight has grown and matured. I think we're pretty well along with our program. It's when we started, we had from our senior management team some pretty specific criteria, and we tried to stick to those. One being, don't create a big bureaucracy. The risks are managed at the operating level, and as a utility, that's where a lot of our risks are, frankly, in the operating area. And second, because the risks are managed directly at the operating level, keep it decentralized. And that's been key to the visibility that we get from involving frontline operating, financial, and regulatory people in the company to inform our key risk indicators and then ultimately our risk map.
Perfect. Thank you. James.
Good morning. My name is James Graves, and I work for Murphy Oil Corporation in El Dorado, Arkansas. My role for the company is new, and my responsibility is to create the function of risk management across our enterprise. Murphy is an integrated oil and gas company that has business worldwide. So we have an upstream, a very robust E&P business that's operating in foreign and domestic locations. We also have a downstream unit that has refineries in several different locations, including internationally. And we have a marketing unit as well that we own and operate. So it's fairly broad and very complex. Although my role is new here at Murphy, I've also done this for another company. I came to Murphy from a construction company, and that construction company built offshore platforms and infrastructure and pipelines for the oil and gas industry, and it also built power generation plants globally, and as well had a nuclear side of the business, both nuclear power gen as well as a fuel cycle. And prior to that, I was a consultant, which trained me well for this role, because a lot of what we do is advisory in nature, bringing the organization together.
Good.
Good morning, I'm Tim Jones. I'm a manager in the Enterprise Risk Management and Portfolio Analysis Group at El Paso Corp. For those of you who aren't familiar with El Paso, we own and operate North America's largest natural gas interstate pipeline system, and we also have a top-tier independent exploration and production company. And just this week, we actually publicly announced that we're going to split off our E&P division. So things for Enterprise Risk Management will change a little bit in terms of the portfolio structure, and we'll clearly be addressing that as we go forward. The Enterprise Risk Management Group has been in existence for about 7 years at El Paso, and it's grown in maturity, but it's maintained the fact that it is very decentralized in terms of management activities. The operational risk and typical risk management is in the business units, and we have monitoring and reporting throughout the organization to inform our ERM group and therefore provide information to our risk oversight committee and to our board. And it's kind of an interesting top-down, bottom-up approach to assessing risk, and I think it's a fairly pragmatic and practical approach without, as David said, creating a large group or overhead related to risk management.
Thank you. So I think maybe the way to start is to talk a little bit about, I think for the audience, what might have been the initial driver for creating your ERM programs in your companies. Was there a certain event? Was there, did it come from the audit committee? Did it come from management? Was it from the board? Kind of what was the origination point? And maybe Tim, we'll start with you.
As I said, we've been a formed group for about 7 years. The drivers for the need for enterprise risk management for El Paso really related to, in the post-Enron wake of events, El Paso had been in some 20 different business sectors, primarily in the energy industry, but not necessarily so. And clearly to sustain ourselves and to gain, basically to keep from going under, we needed to pare those business sectors down. And so there were difficult decisions made. And the company's focus was reduced from those 20 business sectors to 2, those being our natural gas pipelines and our E&P business. But in the process of reducing from those sectors to the few, we were left with a number of legacy assets and things like that. Those things, as you divest, nobody wanted. So the executive committee recognized that we needed some way to monitor the risks across the organization that we weren't actively managing as much as we were within the pipeline group and within our E&P division. So the ERM group was formed to primarily afford an assessment process so that we could establish what our risk profile was, look at our risk inventory, and then make decisions about continuing mitigating efforts, and if there were things related to our legacy assets and exposures that we needed to approach differently from what we were doing with pipelines and E&P. So that was really kind of the driver to form the Enterprise Risk Management Group, and we were basically pulled from other risk management roles within the organization, primarily from the trading and marketing realm, which is where I came from. And we tried to use those same trading and market-based risk principles to develop our ERM program. And we've kind of modified it considerably over the years, but that was pretty much the driver.
Okay, very good. And James?
So our driver, we get the question a lot, did Macondo drive you to do this? And I think in our case, no. The company was looking to advance risk management over the course of the last several years. So even before Macondo came about. A little history on Murphy. Murphy's grown from a family business into a large public company by taking risks and executing well against those. And so the company has very large growth goals, and we'd like and project that we want to be much bigger over time. So we've got these goals, and yet we're faced with a growing business and a larger footprint, and so the risks are beginning to impact on us more as we've grown. And so we want to become more structured as to how we evaluate risk and how we view it and how we take advantage of it. And so that's really the key driver. Our executive management and the board wants better insight into the risk, and they also want to establish better oversight.
Very good. And then David?
I think for CMS, there were a confluence of factors probably which helped launch our ERM program. First, we did have a misstatement in 2002, I believe. A lot of focus on implementing the Sarbanes-Oxley program, and that took a few years to establish and embed in the organization. So ERM is kind of a logical outgrowth of that, I think. Second, you mentioned the audit committees and the board. There was definitely interest in the board and the audit committee in particular about what we're doing in that area. And then I think third, just from the management perspective, as the company shrank down to the core utility primarily, a lot of focus on operational excellence. And I think the ERM program was a good complement to that, aligning your risk understanding with your safe and excellent operations, as we like to call it. So I think just a confluence of events.
Right. Well, and I do think it's interesting, and you all talked a little bit about, pulling together information, and especially, Tim, when you were talking about how the area was built to begin with and where you pulled people from. I think that's one of the challenges that people see and the board sees when they look at an enterprise risk management program. How do you really, how does a board member really see the risks holistically? And how do you pull together maybe potentially different things that are done within the organization into this program? So a more advanced program, probably Tim's, do you want to talk a little bit about that holistic view and pulling together different aspects of the business?
Sure. The importance of looking at risk from an enterprise perspective is when you have a corporate structure that has similar or dissimilar operations, you may or may not have risks which diversify each other, or in some cases may exacerbate each other. So it's important to document the risks individually as you go through your assessment process, and then look at, from a collaborative perspective, how those risks interact and where there are interdependencies in those risks, because it's really in recognizing the interdependencies of risks that you can add the most value from an ERM perspective, is looking at how do these risks work together? Do they create a contagion? Do they have some kind of offset value? And what we try to do at El Paso is we do our individual assessments, and then we roll the individual risks together, and we look at them by category, and we report to the Risk Oversight Committee and to the board related to those high-ranked risks within each category, and try to make sure that our mitigating efforts, both across within the individual business units as well as across the organization, are consistent. So one of the things that we're trying to do through our process is to make sure that we have alignment in our mitigation efforts throughout the organization, and making sure that the board clearly is comfortable with what our risk profile is, because they ultimately define the tolerance. So.
Absolutely. Well, and I think we talked a little bit last night about ranking the risks, and when you're pulling together different perspectives. David, I don't know if you'd like to talk a little bit about kind of the alignment of all of those risks and really how you value per se.
Yeah, sure. For us, it's more about the visibility. So in order to rank your risk, you have to have two things, I think. And that's what we try to achieve with our sort of decentralized approach. Mm-hmm. First, the visibility. What are your risks? And it seems obvious that you would know your risk, but unless you have a sort of bottoms-up approach like Tim was talking about, you might not actually have the visibility you need. Second, in order to rank them, you need a common understanding of the exposure measure, so you can then compare across risk to make the kind of decisions that you need to make to address them. So I think it's the visibility and the comparability, I would say.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And then I think, too, it's interesting with some of the events that have occurred in the Gulf, in San Bruno, Japan, even Toyota, so to take something outside of the oil and gas industry, I think measuring some of those unique type risks, that if you want to call them black swans, or, some of the events that would be less likely but could be more catastrophic in nature. How do you go about measuring that? And is there a difference following some of these events in the way you approach trying to quantify those types of activities? And I'll leave that open to any of you.
I could have a comment around that. One of the most interesting things about this discussion is where there are differences in opinion that come about. And so when you roll up information, as these two gentlemen have talked about, and present it as a bottoms up, the view at the top might be different in certain areas. And so maybe a surprise that the question might be, why is this risk being ranked this way? The other side of it is these low, what we call a black swan, which I choose to look at as a low likelihood incident, but very high impact, and more attention being driven toward having an imagination around there. So what would that mean for us? Macondo is a good example. For us, I think the realization is, gee, this could happen to someone else, but it still will impact our company. Mm-hmm. And so that's one of our takeaways from Macondo is, we weren't really involved in it at all, but we still had major impacts from it. We pulled a drilling rig right out of the Gulf at the outset of that, recognizing very quickly that there would be a moratorium and a delay that we weren't sure exactly how long that would be. And the other thing is that I think surprised, or maybe not surprised, but people hadn't thought about was what was the overall impact and the scale of that impact as it's happened. And so everybody sitting in the room today has a lot better idea, what is an ultimate impact of this type of an incident happening.
Mm-hmm. Other thoughts?
Well, one of the things that, with these incidents which caused us to investigate further was our business continuity and disaster recovery plans, and we actually had a couple of internal audits done around that, and it was pretty revealing as to the preparedness. So the black swan event, by definition, is highly unpredictable. You can have a lot of imagination. It's important to do that. There's no question about it. Just the process of going through what could happen. But it's really your preparedness, and these internal audits were very effective in terms of assessing our exposure to those kind of events. And obviously, we have management action plans, which are designed to mitigate the effects of those kinds of unpredictable, high-impact events.
Absolutely. I think monitoring and making sure that you have someone who's accountable is really a key part of the ERM process. So Tim, any additional thoughts?
Just kind of commenting on one of James's first statements regarding the differences of opinion on kind of the ranking of risks. What we found early on in our efforts was that as we moved away from the corporate structure and the headquarters, and we went out to our business unit headquarters in other areas, there was a very different opinion of risk ranking, and we documented that, we brought it back, and we had some very fruitful and sometimes heated discussions about the ranking of risk. But ultimately what came out of it was the corporate management recognized that there was a difference in kind of the risk criteria in the business units versus corporate, and it forced us to try to come up with a consistent approach, which was valuable. But it also helped those in the executive committee to recognize that there were some issues out in the field offices that they weren't aware of that had a level of significance that warranted some review, and so it kind of led into some audits and things like that later on, and so I think there was a lot of benefit there. On the other topic about the kind of the Black Swan events, I think that as you look at the continuum of the maturity cycle of risk management, your board is very interested in compliance functions and what are they required to know and be aware of as it relates to governance standards for being a listed company or being an SEC registrant and so forth. And then you move to kind of the more strategic concerns, which includes looking at high impact, low probability events, because those are the things that could be major disruptors of your normal processes, and you have to almost take out the probability component altogether and just look at kind of what could this do to us from a strategic perspective. Could this force us to totally redefine ourselves within our industry, or is this significant enough to force us out of business or something like that? And so while that's not the normal process of our risk assessment, it is kind of a new area that we're focusing on, both tracking emerging risks and those high impact risks that could be major game changers or something within our industry.
Absolutely. We talked a little bit about it last night, the risk ranking criteria and the consistency between groups within your organization. Do you want to talk a little bit about that? Because I thought that was very interesting, the linkage and the commonality of basically risk rankings that you use throughout the company, like internal audit compared to what you're doing for ERM, et cetera.
Kind of what Suzanne is talking about, which from our dinner conversation last night, is at El Paso we have over the years defined our risk assessment criteria, and we've agreed upon the nomenclature, the levels, what categories of risk that we're looking at, and they're based upon our mission or our value statements related to our integrity, reputation within industry, safe work processes, operational and clearly financial and business related risks. And we work very closely with our internal audit group, with our financial controls groups, with business excellence and legal, and make sure that as each group individually assesses risk for their own purposes, that we are using a common criteria so that when we discuss risk levels, we know what language we're speaking, and we can then integrate our processes more seamlessly, as much as those groups can interact seamlessly. But it benefits us in a lot of ways, because we don't have to go back and debate exactly what you mean by a significant risk event or something that is moderate in nature, because we've already taken into consideration how we define those up front, and we use that information then can move forward to the real value add, which is mitigating those risks.
Well, and I'd like to explore a little more the interaction with internal audit, because I think we all talked about last night how important that is, and some of the outputs from your risk assessment go right into the internal audit plan that might be developed, and some of the activities that go on there. And so maybe, David, if you want to talk a little bit about that interaction.
Yeah, sure. We work very closely with our very fine KPMG internal audit team.
I didn't mean to do it that way, sorry.
But I'm going for it.
I know.
We do work very closely. We have one risk map that we use for all of our risk assessments, including internal audit, and leverage that quite effectively, I think. Our risk management team, including myself, participates in all of the risk assessment interviews through the annual cycle, and we see all of the reports. But the risk map drives the risk-based audits, so that's a very good linkage because it always includes mitigation, and then that feeds back into our exposure picture. We have ongoing discussions throughout the year with the internal audit team about risks that we're seeing through some of our assessments, which also has in the past driven some of the specific audits that have been part of our plan. And then, of course, we both report to the audit committee as well, so there's a reporting linkage there. But I think it's been very effective for us in terms of identifying the risk and some of the mitigation plans, and we do capture that, I think, pretty effectively.
Okay. Other comments?
Yeah, for us, in both of the roles I've served for risk management, the risk assessment can help inform the audit plan. And so there's automatically a very tight working relationship there. The quantification that's done when you do a risk assessment is helpful as well. I think risk management structures that very well, and it helps to apply the limited resources that we have to the right places. And it also enables a better, more robust discussion around what should the audit plan be at the given point in time.
Tim, any other?
I don't have a lot to add there other than initially as we formed the ERM group, our internal audit group was probably our biggest champion. And clearly, align yourself with those who support you. We formed a very tight working relationship with internal audit, and a few years back, I think the buzz phrase was risk-based audit plans and things like that, and I'm sure we coined that phrase because we were early adopters. But we've always had a tight working relationship with our internal audit group, both supportive of their efforts and our efforts. And as they've stated, the risk assessment informs the audit plan. We participate with them to look at the audit process as they're scoping their audits related to areas of significance for us, and then also looking at the review of their audit findings to see if there are any additional risks or there are mitigating activities that we may not have known about. So it's a consistent dialogue with them, and we're trying to use that model to work with some of the other groups that provide us a lot of information, so that we can really leverage the capabilities in the business without having a lot of overhead within our group.
Just maybe one thing to add. I was just, as these guys were talking, I thought of it. I think when the operating staff and regulatory and others see the collaboration between the internal auditor and the risk group, they see efficiency, as opposed to 2 risk assessments and 2 documentation processes. And we have gotten feedback that positive feedback that's very much appreciated, that you're kind of not wasting their time with too many what'll feel like compliance type exercises, which is what you don't want, obviously.
Right. Well, and I think that leads right into a follow-up question around adding value to the organization. And really, ERMs are designed not just to be something that is, a lot of charts put together and then put on the shelf. What you want to do is have it actively embraced by your company and used to make decisions. And so I guess based on that fundamental premise, what are the ways that you measure the effectiveness of your ERM program? Basically, are you adding value to the company, and how do you quantify that or measure your success? And I'll leave that open to any of you.
I could take a stab at it. This might sound a little squishy, but I would measure my success based on how much the organization embeds risk into their processes. So enterprise risk doesn't really control the management of the risk. The company does that. Our managers on a day-to-day basis do that, hopefully at the right level, depending on what the risk is. What we are is evangelists around the process and making sure where appropriate we get that embedded. An example that I would share with you is we look at a lot of different countries to enter where we presently don't have a presence. And so, our role there is to make sure, have we considered on the front end of making that decision the risks that we take as we move into a new country? And how robust is that discussion? So we want to look at angles, at the risk angles up front before the decision is made, and then factor that in. And it should even be to the level of, well, how much money should we make? We're taking a lot more risk by going, as an example, we've opened a location in Iraq. And so, should our return be more the same or less than we make elsewhere? Those are the types of benefits I think enterprise risk can have. And that's just one example.
Okay.
But I think you hit the nail on the head when you said making decisions. And so the information that comes out of the ERM process, if it's not used, then all you have is a picture, a depiction. So the way we look at it is the use of the information, the risk assessments, and the potential mitigation across the company to sort of facilitate resource allocation effectively. So, I measure success if I see that the risk assessment has influenced a sort of an operating or a capital investment decision. And we have seen that being an asset-intensive company with some of the allocation decisions that have been made over the past few years. Not that it's the primary driver, but it is part of the discussion. And that then would be reflected in your positioning of your exposure, on your risk map kind of thing.
Yeah, and so another source of information basically on which to base these.
Right, there's compliance, there's customer service, there's all kind of regulatory, all kind of reasons why you would make your capital allocation, but we tried to embed in the process that risk assessments and potential risk impacts should be part of that decision making.
Absolutely, absolutely. And Tim, how do you measure success?
Well, this question is always the one that makes ERM people kind of squirm in their chairs, because everybody, we're like, okay, in a down cycle, are we the first ones to go because we can't clearly articulate how we're adding value? We don't really look at the numbers so much as we look at how well the discussions around risk are included in decision making, and just kind of following on what you've stated. And I really like the evangelist approach. I always thought it more kind of we're like the risk cheerleaders. Making sure that there's a fruitful dialogue about risk management throughout the organization is important. And for us, we want to champion that dialogue all the way down to the frontline individuals so that they understand that their actions have risks or mitigate risks depending on what they're doing, and how that all rolls up into our overall strategy. So our organizational structure is that ERM is actually a part of our strategy and enterprise business development group. So as we look at strategy decisions, we try to incorporate the risk understanding and the mitigating efforts into those strategy decisions, and we look at our plan assumptions and what are the risks around our plan assumptions. And so over time, we are becoming much more integrated into the direction of the organization through, as you said, an additional piece of information that informs and hopefully creates better decision-making.
Yeah, just to second that, you see it when you attend meetings and people, in terms of risk awareness or risk evangelists, where people who aren't risk managers, throw out kind of out of the blue, you're sitting there as a risk manager, well, wait a minute, have we thought of the risk of that kind of decision? So, you almost kind of work yourself out of a job,
Yeah, yeah.
Thank God for the risk map.
Yeah,
Someone's got to do it.
Well, I do think that's a good point. Making it part of the culture is really the direction that you're going, and I think making it part of the regular decision making, and it's not a surprise when somebody thinks to themselves, well, what about the risk related to that, or have we considered that component? Absolutely. So let's talk a little bit about reporting. And the structure, I guess, from two angles. Maybe the first is reporting to the board and some of the information that you share with the board, or what level of information maybe you share with the board versus what level of information you're sharing with management, and maybe the timing of those types of things. So maybe, Tim, I'll start with you.
We have basically an annual reporting cycle related to our risk assessments. And once a year, we report to the audit committee regarding our process. And so they review the risk assessment process and the reporting to make sure that they're comfortable with that as it relates to our controls and so forth. And then we also annually report the results of our risk assessment process, and that goes to the full board. And that's a fairly recent change, because last year was the first year that the report went to the full board. Previously, it went to the audit committee, and then everybody else is invited if they wanted to attend, and the room was packed. But so that's a little differently from a policy perspective. We have a risk oversight committee, which is an executive committee that we report to quarterly, and we annually report on the status of our enterprise risk management policy and the reference policies that are within the business units. So we're kind of reviewing our process on an annual basis, and then we have our periodic risk assessment, which is kind of an ongoing process. We have a major initiative that includes all of the interviews where we're going out to the field offices and talking to our risk owners regarding the status of the risks, and we aggregate that information to create the risk profile. So what the board sees on an annual basis is what we call our high-ranked risks. So they fall within our two highest categories. We provide them a description of the risks, how we've rated the impact level, the probability of occurrence, which those two tailor the risk level, what we're currently doing from a mitigating perspective, and what we anticipate doing more of, or ongoing risk mitigating activities. We also include the maturity rating for the controls for the mitigating activities, so that we look at it, is this something that it's a new initiative? Is this a process that we've been working through for years? Mainly, if you look at our hedging activities, clearly our hedging processes are mature and robust, and the reporting and review of that is consistent. So you're going to get a really very high maturity rating on those. For some of the more operational things, we may have something that's mature, or we may have something that's less mature. One of the areas of focus for us now is reporting on emerging risks.
Okay.
So we are asked by our internal audit group to assist them in identifying emerging risks for our audit committee, and that's done quarterly. So we've started various means of tracking emerging risk, reviewing periodicals, looking at discussions within the industry and beyond industry, and things that might impact us, and we aggregate that information and choose those which we think might be most interesting and impactful to our business, and report those to the audit committee on a quarterly basis.
Okay. And when did you start doing that, did you say?
We've been doing the emerging risk report a little over a year.
Okay. Anything particular trigger that?
It actually began, I think, as a result of the AIG and the financial crisis.
Okay.
Really, we were looking at were there signs within the broader global market that might have helped us to recognize where we had some risk, either concentrations or concerns. So we just started kind of monitoring periodicals and things like that and helping them to become more informed. And the interesting thing about it is now we get, because our board is very engaged in looking at emerging risks, we get calls from them saying, have you heard anything about this? Or, oh, by the way, here's an article, you might look into that, that may lead all the way to a full-scale risk scenario that we're looking at a specific incident or something.
And that's an interesting commentary. I think, having board members or audit committee members call you, to discuss current events and just to get a feel. I mean, it really raises the level of, excellence in the company and really having the board members see you as an expert, per se in that area. That's good.
So for Murphy, the reporting is to the full board, and as well as the last company that I worked for. When you see the breadth of the information, some of the risks are treated within the committees, but when you consolidate it all together, everyone feels comfortable in front of the full board, and that's the feedback, versus a pure audit committee reporting relationship. I think the emerging risk is probably the number one question we get. Tell me what we don't know already. Help me to understand the future, sort of the crystal ball. What I need to worry about that I'm not aware of. And there's a couple of resources that I think are good, for companies to seek out. One, there is a World Economic Forum study done every year, and it's got a 10-year time horizon on it of major world sort of megatrends and a risk analysis around that. And I will recommend everybody get a copy of that and kind of factor it into these your thought around emerging risks, because that's a good subject matter. And I think Tim also had cited the Executive Conference Board. Is that right?
Corporate Executive Board.
Corporate Executive Board. Excuse me. That also does a report on a much more frequent basis. It seems like it was like quarterly, where they're rolling up information from a variety of different industries that could give, help give the creative types some insight into what to think about. And those are just a couple of methods to look at emerging risk.
Good. David?
Yeah, we're pretty similar at CMS to Murphy and El Paso with the board visibility. Twice a year reviews with the audit committee and the board. Audit committee a little more focused on the process, overall risk management and policy. Board obviously sees the full risk map, and that's a once-a-year exercise with sort of an interim update prior to that. Our management team sees more. Our key risk indicators, we started sharing those early on the operational side, which is where a good 50% of our risk items on our risk map lie. But this year we're going to review all of our key risk indicators. There's quite a few of them that underpin the risk map with the executive management team through our risk committee, which is basically the executive management team.
Okay, very good. I just wanted to remind everyone, if you have questions, I think there's some people that are walking around to pick up cards. If you have any questions, please feel free to jot those down, and we'll get those at the end of the session. I think maybe I'll wrap it up with with our prepared questions, with kind of an overall thought about what are your plans for the future. If you look down the line, maybe a year, 3 years from now, what do you see your area evolving into? What do you think that the key focus areas will be that you'll be concentrating on? So I'll start with you, David.
Well, I think at CMS, we've gotten to a point where we've done a pretty good job with our risk assessments, but I worry a little bit about complacency. Many of you probably had the Sarbanes experience, very high level of interest, 8 years ago. after a while it wanes a little bit, and we want to, keep that going. The reason is, you're always concerned about visibility. Are you really as deeply embedded in the organization as you need to be? Is there anything hidden there? Just, regular operating risks that, aside from the emerging risk. So that's kind of one area. I think this emerging risk, these guys are probably a little bit further along than we are in terms of identifying and having a robust process to generate that list. So that's something I'd like to develop. And then I think over time, and we talked a little bit about this last night, embedding the ERM and the risk perspective in the strategy development process. And that is definitely starting to converge at CMS, but that is real value there, I think, when you, because your risk profile says a lot about your company, which then would sort of inform your strategy development discussion. So I think that will converge a little more over time.
Absolutely. James?
And for us, we're just getting started, so right now it's an educational process. Risk management, everyone doesn't think in terms of risk management. You've got about 20% of the people who naturally think this way. What am I trying to do? What can stop me? And what do I need to do to make sure I'm successful? Taking a cycle around that. Other people, it's a little tougher. At the start of this, it's getting everyone on the same page. I think down the road, I agree with David, it is an integration into the decision process, so you go very quickly to integration with strategy, integration with planning, trying to lever up a little bit more with the audit side of the house in terms of our mitigation activities and our controls around the risks themselves, and then preparing for what's to come. Okay, and where do we want to be in the next 3, 5, 10 years, and how can I build up and help the company build up the ability to take more risk to facilitate that growth.
Okay.
I think for El Paso, one of the things we have to figure out, what does our risk profile look like after we've split off the E&P company, and we want to continue maturing our process of working with strategy to be a part of the decision making and making sure that risk is appropriately considered in those decisions. One area that we're trying to improve upon, as we've stated, is an execution focus in all of our activities. And one thing, we have a business excellence group, and they're looking at our mega processes. So they've identified a number of processes which relate to various aspects of the business, from everything from hire to retire, procure to pay, lots of catchy little buzz phrases like that. But what it represents is an opportunity to gain efficiency and effectiveness in your management and your process controls. And so what we're doing is we're trying to link our assessed risks to those mega processes, and so that we are trying to identify within processes that we're reviewing where there are risk concentrations, or where we may not have identified a risk in our current assessment, which may illustrate that there is a complacency or something in terms of the processes related to that. As David said, one of the risks in your process is that people become too comfortable with it, and they don't look under the rocks hard enough. And so we want to make sure that we're consistently challenging our managers throughout the organization to make sure that they're recognizing risk and we're appropriately responding to those risks.
Okay. So we have quite a few questions. This is great. So let me start with one. The question is, could each of the panelists mention what their company's number one risk is and how it's being managed / mitigated? So now you have to fess up.
Sure.
What's the biggest risk?
Yeah, for CMS, given the fact that our primary business, 95% approximately, is electric and gas utility, it's definitely regulatory. Mm-hmm. It's number one. It covers across the board. Probably second would be operational, just the nature of the business. But and third, close third, commodity prices, but that's related to regulatory. So it very much around the regulatory risk.
Okay. Okay, and then how do you manage or mitigate that then? Because, I mean, there are a lot of forces outside your control there, clearly.
Well, it's mostly our Michigan regulator, so that
Okay.
relationship is hugely important for us.
Mm-hmm.
So getting the right people, the right communication, and obviously keeping your costs down. I mean, it's all about cost to the customer for the regulator. So those are the two main drivers that we have.
Perfect.
Well, for us, and probably a lot in the room, I mean, the economy, the external factors are what are driving up to the top for us, the uncertainty around externalities. And so, we think we can control what we can control, but it's these uncontrollables that worry us. And we have a risk management process around that. So, what could be the impacts of changes in these externalities? Trying to quantify that down a little bit, more than vague, and put dollars to it if we can, to help us in our reaction time. And then looking at the drivers and how the drivers of that risk, measuring it. So what's our visibility into these external factors? Trying to shorten the time frames that we have to react, basically, by better visibility in monitoring those trends. And so that, for us, it's the externalities.
Okay.
We kind of have a really tight-knit top three pretty much, but the number one is probably commodity exposure and the impact that it has on the various activities within our business. Because if crude prices get too high, then you have concerns about demand destruction and what happens with the global market and economic recovery. Natural gas prices are too low. What are we doing? What are we doing about our throughput on our pipelines? So, commodity is probably our number one. What are we doing about it? We have an active hedging program that we utilize, and to try to reduce those risks to an acceptable level. We try to make sure that we're responsive in terms of our operational activities, so that we can ramp up or ramp down as necessary, related to what's happening with the economy and specifically with the commodity prices. We also, as a major portion of our corporate structure is regulated by the federal, the FERC, we have a lot of regulatory risks that we have concerns about, and at the risk of upsetting Tyson Slocum if he's in the room, we work very diligently to advocate our positions, both from El Paso perspective, from a natural gas pipelines industry perspective, and from a consumer perspective, the value of natural gas in the energy mix, and then we have clearly a lot of operational risks as we take into consideration the level of activities that we have, the nature of our businesses. We have 2 LNG facilities. We have lots of 48,000 miles of pipeline that there are a lot of unknowns, as you know, with the San Bruno incident. Lots of concerns about aged pipe and the integrity of it. So we have very robust pipeline integrity programs. As David mentioned last night at dinner, he said, I think El Paso is solely responsible for the Pipeline Safety Act, and that's not something we're proud of, because the result of that was a major explosion on a pipeline in New Mexico. And so we're trying to make sure that we don't have another one of those. We don't want to be responsible for the next Pipeline Safety Act. And so we have very robust integrity processes that are helping us make sure that we can assure our customers and the broader community that we are operating safely and we have their concerns at heart, and it's not just about making the money. So reputational risk is something we take very seriously. And not everything equates to a dollar figure. So, we want to make sure that we're recognizing those types of risks almost as highly as the commodity risks within the organization.
Very good. Another question, two-part question. Where does the ERM group report? And then how many full-time employees do you have in the group? So we'll start with you, David.
I report to the CFO, so we're in the finance area. And full-time, we have a number of part-time. It's not many in terms of our group. Again, we leverage all of the operating groups, so I would say 3 maybe.
Okay.
But it's, again, collecting the information, providing the right tools, and then, of course, challenging as you go through the key risk indicator assessments and that kind of thing. So pretty light for us.
Okay. James?
Yeah. For us, I report into finance, so I report to the company's chief financial officer. And I have a lot of dotted line relationships, I'll just say that. We've got 100 vice president level and up managers that I interface with, and that's how we implement enterprise risk management at Murphy presently.
Okay.
As I stated earlier, our enterprise risk management group reports to our senior vice president of strategy and enterprise business development, who reports to the CEO. And from a staffing level, we have 6 full-time employees, but we also have responsibility for the daily marketing risk management activities. So, that's falls under ERM, but it's really kind of its own special activity. And like James said, we maintain a number of relationships. We have 67 identified risk owners throughout the organization that we interact with on a regular basis to make sure that we're up to date on the risks throughout the organization, and then we talk to just about everybody that we can about risk in our cheerleading role. So, small group, hopefully a big impact.
I like that. Small group, big impact. How do you keep employees from getting risk fatigue in light of various initiatives, including Sarbanes-Oxley internal audit reviews? I think that this is a challenge, this thought of risk fatigue, and how do you keep people interested? I'll let any one of you start.
Well, I would say you focus on the risks that matter to the organization. I mean, there's very little fatigue around those. So if you get the right ones identified, and that's where your emphasis is, and you have management supporting it, it's very hard to get fatigued by this. If it's a fatigue factor, I'd say you're probably not hitting the right mark if people are disinterested. I find more often than not people are very engaged in this subject.
Okay, good.
Yeah, I would say go light on the surveys, because people don't want to necessarily take the time for that. So the frequency, I think you just got to be careful with. You could do monthly updates, but I'm not sure what you'd be achieving there. And then second, establish the understanding of the impact, that try to drive the value to the operating people. I think that also they'll recognize that, when they see it. So you just have to, keep emphasizing how it impacts decision, how it's helping them do their job. That's a tough thing to do because they own the risk. They know a lot more than we do about the risk, but that's what we try to do.
Another question, I like this one. How do you bring third parties into your ERM risk assessment and mitigation plans? So we're talking contractors, agents, customers. Kind of how is that part of your overall program?
I mean, I'll jump out on a limb here and say it sounds compliance related in a lot of ways. You're trying to influence, others that support the organization. So you do that through contracts, you do that through systems and through processes. And so what jumped out at me, we've got lots of FCPA exposure, and as you know, an agent can get you in trouble there. And so we try to do, again, you need to do that through a legal process and the contractual process, as well as having audit and follow-up.
Yeah, trying to think of how to answer that, but I guess I would think of third party. We share some of the information with outside parties, rating agencies, that kind of thing. That's sort of one general area. a kind of limited confidential basis, insurance underwriters sometimes. The other is with counterparties. You know, I guess just out of the risk assessment processes, you know, we have seen some areas, you know, the contracting process and how risks are allocated in contracts. We actually had an internal audit done on that. So we've, you know, brought on some processes and risk reviews, which has helped that manage that risk, and that directly impacts contractors, counterparties. You know, with customers, is public safety, you know, being an energy company, keeping the focus on proper assessment of that is another way, I think, that the risk process can have impacts, beneficial impacts on third parties.
Okay. Tim, I might direct this one to you. Do you use quantitative and statistical techniques to quantify risks? And then also, what do you see as best practice in measurement of risks?
We do kind of a hybrid risk assessment, both quantitative and qualitative, because clearly there are those types of risks that are much more easy to assign numbers to, and statistical information. Our assessment criteria looks at both the dollar impact of the risk, as well as assessing it based upon the kind of the value principles that I talked about a little bit earlier, in terms of its impact to our integrity, our safety, our operational capabilities, and our financial and reputational impacts. So we have kind of a hybrid approach in looking at from an impact perspective, and then looking at just the statistical probabilities of occurrence and where things would fall in a distribution. We don't spend as much time on looking at the distribution around the risk as kind of the how we're feeling about the risk, and what we think where the risk might move. So kind of the migration of risk from one quadrant in the heat map to another, or the velocity of risk, as you hear a lot recently regarding assessing risk. We're not as tied up into the quantitative aspects as more in just the discussion and the increasing the awareness of the risk, so that we can get to the mitigating activities.
I would have an example in terms of project risk. These techniques can be pretty valuable, and so in my last job, we had a project risk management process. The risks were identified, quantified, put through a Monte Carlo simulation in order to set aside contingency on the project. After the project was inked, if it was inked and the project went forward, the view was to harvest that contingency into profit, which drops straight to your bottom line. So those types of techniques can be very beneficial to an organization, and so very favorable outcomes if it's done right.
I like to think about it from, if you think of a risk map where you have the x-axis as probability and the y of impact, there's sort of quantitative approaches to both sides. One is, and we try to work with the operating groups on actually analyzing from a quantitative perspective those two axes. On the probability, what are your KPIs, and how do they inform the probability of a risk event happening? So we find that there's often a lot of data, but it's just picking out, the data that relates to the failure, whatever the risk is. So that would be on your probability side. And on your impact, we try to quantify in dollar terms as best we can. It's not always possible. Tim mentioned the reputation risk earlier. That's clearly one of our impact assessment criteria. But we do try to quantify and help the operating groups quantify what the financial result would be of the risk that they're most worried about.
Yeah, very good.
If I could just add one thing, I think it's important too, as you identify the risk, and even if you're adding a quantitative component or not is really underlying the drivers or the factors that influence that. So you can, through your quantitative analysis, you can do sensitivities around those factors and see which are the most strongest influencing components. And that may be some stress testing or Monte Carlo simulation. We don't spend a lot of time with simulation beyond maybe doing collateral sensitivities and liquidity analysis for our credit counterparties. But it's really important to look at what are the underlying drivers within those kind of your risk categories and see what you can do to mitigate those, whether it's a quantitative or qualitative assessment.
And this may, I'm looking at my watch, this may be our last one, and this is to all three. We're talking a lot about quantifying the risks, and how you do that. The question is, do you quantify your risk appetite and tolerance? And if so, is there any value to that exercise?
I'll take a stab at that. That was probably the when we first started the ERM group, all of the best practice literatures, which was kind of historically based on insurance and financial industry trends, was you've got to identify the risk appetite, and there's a number and stuff like that. Well, in the wake of going from 20 business sectors to 2, we were all over the place. And so what we decided was to spend less time trying to identify a number and spend more time looking at how we wanted to define the impact levels and the risks, and then effectively say these are in the heat map. So this is the area that we consider red, which means we need to respond and we don't like it. And we employ the various risk management techniques: avoid, reduce, transfer, or accept. And so we think it's more important to have that dialogue with your board regarding where things fall on your heat map, and then say, okay, on our assessment criteria, when we say this is the risk level and it's in this red block over here, that tells me we've got to do something about it. And so we don't have a hard and fast number, although those quadrants have a quantitative component to them. But we have the ongoing discussions with the board, and we've adjusted that the heat map over the period. Because a few years back, when El Paso wasn't as strongly positioned, we had a very heavy debt, and we were nearer to bankruptcy than we wanted to be. Our tolerance levels were much lower. And so over time, as we've shored up our balance sheet considerably, then we've adjusted those risk levels appropriately to include a stronger tolerance of risk.
Well, we calculate a tolerance number to help us set our impact scale, and so what we look to do is to come to agreement on a number that would be an EBIT impact in a quarter that would be a moderate impact, something that would make us uncomfortable, and then we can scale up to a catastrophic from there, scale down to something less significant, and that number is arrived basically by looking at various components, so assets and revenues, working capital, and baking it, basically baking a number around that and getting agreement to that. On the subject of risk appetite, this is talked about quite a bit in our functional area, I guess, by practitioners. And I personally think it's very important to have those types of discussions and to try to formalize that, although I understand it's very hard to do, and we haven't done it yet. But what it gives you is sort of a roadmap to say what's important to the organization at the top level, and it puts it on paper. And so it gives the organization, management, the board, even the investors a way to reflect, okay, on how much risk we're taking, where are the parameters, where are the outlines of where we want to be versus when are we getting outside of what we need to protect.
Yeah, I'd like to think about that in terms of your risk-reward profile. So you almost have to think about what business you're in. And for us, as a utility company, we have sort of a capped reward profile, essentially, but we have a lot of downside risk. So that would drive us to a very low risk tolerance. So that's what we drive toward, but there's only so much capital that you have. There's only so much resource. So you do kind of have to pick and choose there. It makes it a little bit tougher because we just don't have those kind of investments, at least not today with our business, primarily a regulated utility, that would give you a higher reward profile.
Okay, very good. Well, our time is up for today, but I know that this has been a very interesting discussion, and getting the perspectives from all three of you, I'm sure, has been very valuable for everyone. So please join me in thanking our panelists for their great contribution. And with that, our session is ended and lunch is served. Thank you.